Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
I'm chuckling because I thought of the word expert. Am I an expert in practice or about practice? Well, all the time I've invested in pondering the nature of practice, I guess I could be. But this podcast conversation with Whitney Walrath was so stunningly insightful on her part. She's the expert. I'm the appreciator. She gets it. She is what Peter Vale and I conjectured about in regard to someone who's self-aware, someone who is in charge of all the faculties that she applies to her work and to the rest of her life, and on and on. But listen to this conversation with Whitney, and it's premium stuff. And humbling for the so-called expert on practice, David Fearon. But you didn't intend to humble me. She's too kind. But this is Whitney Walrath, who is Vice President for Business Development. That's her promotion for the Rexel Corporation, which is a global company that distributes all kinds of electronic components for the home and for the business and for the world. And it's changing. And I have characterized her, as you'll soon hear if I can stop yakking, I have characterized Whitney as a changer. Her practice is to be a changer. You'll see what I mean. Here we go. Well, I have gotten into my covered wagon, and I've gotten up on the Oregon Trail, and I've traveled all the way to Denver in my imagination to reconnect with a really great practitioner. And we'll fill in the gaps of what. But Whitney Walrath gets what it means to be a practitioner. And she hasn't even told me that yet. I'm just telling you because I knew Whitney when we worked once on a leadership development program, a really cutting edge leadership development program. And I saw this pattern of clarity in regard to how she's using her experience, both to benefit, obviously, the company and the folks we're serving, but also to use that experience to sort of rolling it up and putting it into her lesson box and becoming smarter about things. So, Whitney, welcome to the Practice Podcast.
Well, thank you, Doc. I appreciate you inviting me. I've always enjoyed us working together, so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I like to come up with a thought before we start of an impression for people like you whom I know. And here's what I jotted down. The first word that I put down was change. I thought, well, who doesn't? I mean, change is everywhere now. But I will tell you quickly that one thing Peter Vale said in one of our podcast conversation was, Dave, there's only one reason for leadership: change. Think about it, Dave. If something doesn't have to change, you don't need leadership. So you assess whether it needs change or not. And if it does, someone has to take the first bite on the apple. So I always thought of you, Whitney, looking at your resume on LinkedIn. You had a number of jobs, usually lasting a couple of years. I thought, on the surface, gee, in my day, if someone had a resume that showed that they were changing jobs every 2 years, we think they're kind of flaky. But that's why I added one more letter, because you weren't flaky at all. Whitney, I'll edit the stumble. Whitney Walrath is a changer. I added an R. You're a changer. What do you think?
I think that's fair.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I think, it's funny when I think back to when I was younger, I would have put myself in the camp of a little bit nervous about change. Change would have, made me a little bit cautious, a little bit nervous. And then as I really started my professional career, I think I really started to embrace it and love it and find the right kind of path for it. Like not change for change's sake by any means. I mean, none of us need that. None of us just need change for change, but to really understand the opportunity for it and figure out where there's a role. I like working with people. I think communication is one of my strong points. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces of change is just being able to communicate why, what, how, where are we progressing? What's the next step? How do we keep going from here? Recognizing, the successes, recognizing where there's failures or where there's opportunities to improve. And I think it's something I have actually, built my career around a little bit. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you pointing it out, I think you're right. And when I think about what has led from one role to the next as I've evolved, it has been around those changes, whether it's kind of the natural evolution of the next piece that I'm carrying on in a bigger kind of strategy for the organization, or whether, I'm being asked to kind of manage another change process in a new capacity. Mm-hmm. I would say that's been part of it, but I agree. It's actually really insightful what Peter said too about leadership. I think you're right. The industry I'm in is a very old school industry. Part of the reason that we're going through so much change and have in the last decade or so is because we're evolving and adapting a lot of technology. It is changing the way we work. It's changing the way we interact with our customers, with our suppliers. And, it's interesting when you talk to some of the folks who've been around for a long time. You're right. I think leadership historically has been more about just kind of keeping the ship running, just kind
of nice and steady, very traditional business in regard to putting electric components and parts out into your what do you call them now? Not stores.
Yeah, our branches.
Your branches, yeah. And electricians and others do-it-selfers would come in and they would buy, and there were SKUs and all that. And it was such an orderly life.
It was. It's not anymore. But it's not. You're right.
It's not anymore.
No, it's changing, especially with supply chain. Honestly, in the last, you want to talk about more change in the last 2 years, that has been a huge shift. I mean, a huge thing that has required all of us to think differently and work differently. But you're right. I think leadership is such an important part of that. It's not just keeping the day-to-day going, but it's really how do we adapt? How do we keep getting better and meet some of the challenges?
I can remember one of our early conversations, and I think we might have been talking about how we introduced the concept of comfort zone into the next leadership development program. And you were talking, and I think you said, what I really could be most comfortable doing is something having to do with analytics, crunching numbers and seeing, the tallies of sales and everything coming together. That was comfort. I mean, that was your very comfortable sweet spot. Am I right in my memory there?
Yep.
And you and I probably wouldn't have met if you had stayed in that role, but you probably would have been making hopefully a steady living and doing other things that matter to you. But your job itself would just be comfortable, so you could do things that matter to you outside of the job. But over time, what I've seen in your resume is that you look to see where in this particular company where the changes are going to have to happen. And you're a part of that. I can remember toward the end of our collaboration, there was going to be a branch up in the north part of Colorado, was it?
Yep.
Or the next state over. And it was basically new territory. I was kidding about coming out on the Oregon Trail, but you were essentially doing some trailblazing there, weren't you? You remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, no. And I think, what it is, I enjoy challenges. And I think that's part of what comes with change is finding those opportunities for a challenge. So, we all like the stability of doing the things we're good at or the things that come easy to us or come natural to us. And I do too. I mean, we all like that. But I think more important for me is being challenged. And that requires change. That requires being pushed out of your comfort zone. That requires finding those areas that maybe nobody else wants to do, or everybody else has decided is not worth doing, or it's too hard to do. And not that I necessarily have some magic solution to make it work, but just I think approaching it with an openness and a willingness to try and come in and get a different perspective and collaborate. Nothing I've done has been on my own, so collaborate. So I think that's what drives it more than anything for me, is always seeking a new challenge.
Yeah. Back to Peter Vail again. When in 1989, a book came out that he wrote called Managing as a Performing Art. In fact, I think maybe you and I and Jackie talked about that. Because what he put in that book was the enduring idea that we are all entering permanent whitewater. There's no still water, and there's no bank to stand on for very long. You're going to be swept along. So what you knew for sure today would fail you tomorrow. And in conjecture, in our new book on Practice as a Way of Being, which I finished after Peter passed away, there was a whole string of learning challenges that he listed in one of the chapters connected to whitewater. And I think if you looked at that list, you'd say, wait, that's, like 17 items. That was just my day. But they weren't just challenges. They were learning challenges. You say what I mean about that?
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, one of the things you and I had spent some time working on was talking to you about generational differences. And this is where I do think, I'm a late millennial, right on the cutoff of a millennial. And I think I had the benefit of my whole career, my whole professional life has been whitewaters, right? It has always been change. I entered the working world right around the Great Recession. So, I didn't know much else other than kind of chaos and having to respond and, not sure, uncertainty. And so in some ways, I think, myself and maybe generations younger than me, we have a little bit of an advantage just because we don't know anything else.
That's a huge point. I never thought of that, but you put a perfect circle around that. You didn't know better. You hadn't had what my generation had, were years and years of steady, peaceful, easy to plan life.
Yeah.
And
it's
went
funny.
away in 2008.
Right. And things are cyclical. Life is cyclical. Business cycles are cyclical. But I remember when, COVID started a couple of years ago, all of us weren't sure, right? We weren't sure in March of 2020 what was going to happen. It looked like the economy it shut off overnight. But it was very similar to kind of that 2007, 2008 from a business perspective, right? You look at, okay, what costs can we hold back on? What can we defer? Where can we cut? Obviously trying to preserve employees and salaries. Last thing we want to do is let people go. So what else can we do? And I remember I had a couple of younger employees that only been in the workforce for a couple of years. They were terrified. They were in my office terrified. Like, what does this mean? Am I getting fired? And it's like, no, we've been through this before, right? We've been through this before. It'll be okay. We'll work through things, kind of explain to them what to expect. Things are going to change. Here's what to expect. But yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, and I don't know that those cycles come, it feels like they're coming more frequently. Maybe that's just time passing, but it's been more, I think it's helped. It's helped a little bit because it's not as out of the norm. I mean, which isn't great, but it helps those of us who have gone through these, that you have some experience.
Practices, locations, solutions to supplies, staffing.
Yep.
Where's some adapting going on on your agenda right now that you can talk about?
Yeah, I think all of those things. I mean, you hit it on the head. I mean, staffing is a challenge. I think that's a challenge. I don't even think it's unique to our industry. I don't even think it's unique to the US. I think this is a global phenomenon where the workforce is changing. There's not enough people. There's not enough people to fill the jobs we have. And even the type of work that they're doing is changing. So that's a continual challenge of figuring out, how do we get enough people? How do we keep them, retain them? I think, you're right. My career path, and I've changed jobs every couple of years. I think used to feel pretty unusual. Now I think it's not as unusual. And so you have people that you bring in and they're looking for something new in a year. And so how do you either, right? And so how do you either continue to engage them in a way that they're feeling enriched and they're still feeling satisfied and they're getting what they want, or be able to change roles that quickly, quite frankly. I mean, and that's hard for an organization to do. That's really hard for an organization to do. So
absolutely,
staffing is a huge one. The supply chain has introduced a whole new complexity for us and our manufacturing partners of really having to get creative and understand logistics of how we handle things, our partnerships, and really change some of the product offering even. I mean, you have situations where maybe a customer wasn't willing to take on a newer technology, but that's the only product that's now available. It's forcing some changes in the industry, which aren't all bad, to be honest. They're not all bad, but it is definitely added a new element that we've not had to do before. It's added a complexity. And in some ways it's been good, because in some ways, a lot of what we do as a distributor is the supply chain, and it's really showed the value of logistics and the value of managing that. So in that part, it's been pretty positive, but it's been a lot of work. Technology is changing. So how our customers work, how we work. I mean, Zoom meetings and, being able to be digitally connected. We're trying to go paperless. We're, like all organizations, we're trying to do what we can for the environment and trying to figure out how do we go paperless, which means now maybe, our guy in the warehouse, instead of walking around with a piece of paper and circling it, they've got an iPhone or they've got a tablet. So, things are changing really, I'd say almost on all fronts. Training is another one. I think, again, the pandemic really changed this. I personally think, in-person training is one of the best, if not the best way to do things. But, we didn't have that luxury for, a year and a half. Mm-hmm. So how do we do things again, like Zoom meetings, or is it video calls? I mean, how do you get creative and be able to still teach people when you can't necessarily sit down in front of them? So I think a lot has changed, especially in the last 2 years.
Recognize, for example, in training that you might have had a nice tidy package to train about it, whatever it might be.
Right.
And then it is obsolete or it has to be modified. So even the curriculum, the material, the content of training itself has to keep up and almost and definitely anticipate what's next. So that role that once you and Jackie and I assisted out from the outside had, when you were looking at what do they need to know from technical to strategic. It's hard to package that now, isn't it, Whitney?
It is, but what's interesting, and I remember us talking about this, and this was a couple of years ago, and talking about the idea of, kind of open source, training or open source classes and curriculum. And, I think there's the more formal piece of that where you go to, a university setting, or you get kind of a formal presentation from an expert, so to speak. And then there's honestly YouTube. I was just having this conversation last week. So we have a new salesperson. He's only been with us for about 2 months, and he's really taken a liking to solar as a product category. We have some training that our manufacturers have provided us, but to your point, it could be a year old, which in that category makes it kind of obsolete. It gets you the basics, but it's not the most current. Well, this individual, he's just been watching YouTube videos. He's completely educated himself on a new product category in the matter of a couple of months, just by doing his own research and watching YouTube videos.
That is great.
So that changes it too.
That's the one I would want to hire if I were in any organization right now.
Right.
Because that's practice. That is a person who says, I'm going to contribute to this company. And obviously but if there isn't something readily available on solar, I want to know a lot more about solar. I want to be the solar guy.
Right.
And maybe I'll take that forward into my life in other ways. Because, hey, guess what? Solar is it. Fossil fuels are going, solar is it. And we're electricians. So we got to have a current. So that is a great story. And it's true that I'm having to migrate the work that I've been doing onto YouTube because it's easier to make sure it's saved on YouTube over the long haul. As long as I pay the bills on my podcast site right now, it'll be there. But the minute I stop paying, I won't be able to access all these great podcasts anymore. So my editor from my library said, Dave, you got to migrate that. So he took me up to YouTube last Friday on our weekly call. And I go, oh, my head spun. I looked at YouTube when I was a professor, and some students said, Doc, you should really take a look at YouTube. This is 20 some years ago when it was just kicking off, and it hadn't been purchased by Google. It was a standalone. And I thought, hey, cool, 2,000 videos.
Right.
They get that in a nanosecond now. But
Right.
It's wonderful how people are self-organizing and using the video. And that'll tell you something else about the difference in the way people prefer to get their information now. We put our book out as a digital book, probably one of the very first in our field, in the field of organization and change. And it's not people are going, digital, what? I'll be sending you a link to it. But and I said, wait a minute, think about this. I can add to that book indefinitely. I can click in this podcast recording. I can click in an article. I can keep making that book more and more valuable. Can you do that with a book that's made of paper and sitting on a shelf? No. And so I'm kind of leaning into where YouTube and other things are going in terms of the self-directed learner. And that kind of teaching is changing as well, then I assume. I want to get back to this new title of yours. And now business development, is that marketing?
So it's a little bit of marketing. It's also some new segments. So more of the commercial sales management. So if you look at my career, I've done a lot more on what I'd call the functional support side of things. So I've led purchasing, I've led operations. I've been involved in vendor alignment. I did have a small sales role when I was early on in my career. So I've had a little bit of exposure to the sales side, but I've never had really a leadership role in the sales part of it. This is really leading the sales part of the organization. So if you look at our region over the last couple of years, we've been incredibly successful. We're growing gangbusters, and that's really in our traditional business space. So some of it has been new branches and growing in territory. Some of it's just growing market share in the markets that we're in. What we're really looking at as we look at a 3 to 5 year plan of where do we go from here is developing some additional segments. So going out and solar and anything in the energy green space. So solar, EV charging, lighting efficiency, LED, any of that piece of it it's a part of our business now, but it's a small part, and there's a ton of opportunity to grow. We look at some complementary type businesses like datacom and low voltage. Again, it's a place that we've played in a little bit, but not really. There's a huge opportunity there. And then we look at services, which traditionally we're a distributor. We handle boxes. We touch product. Services is a piece, though, that is continuing to grow as you look at the software packages to support the technology we have, or helping our customers commission different products and get them up and running, or troubleshoot if there's a problem once they are running. And so that's a new segment that we're looking at as well, which is very different for our business model and how we operate. Absolutely different.
But it happened naturally, I assume, at a branch. If someone came up to the counter and started to talk about some challenge they're having with a thermostat that you guys had sold,
exactly,
then someone would say, well, wait a minute, I'll call Bob up here. He knows all about that. So there'd be a little bit of service going on there. But now you're talking about blowing that out into another business, galaxy, if you will, for the company. I'm tuning in, particularly when you mentioned the chargers, given the latest bill that just made it through the enormous change bill. There's that word again. And thinking of where you are in Colorado, in the states thereto pertaining, there's an awful lot of distance that out there. If you get outside of Denver, where are you? So I'm just thinking about conceptually, how can we have enough chargers, since almost all the car makers are saying we're done with gasoline, 3-4 years. how are you guys noodling that charger thing? Because there's going to be a lot of demand to put them everywhere, including down
there's
your smallest
absolutely.
towns, and that's a lot of components and a lot of wire.
It is absolutely. And, I think there's a couple of different, there'll be the residential. So anyone who has one in their homes and having them in residential facilities, there'll be more of the commercial space. So you go to the grocery store while you're inside buying your groceries, you'll charge your car. Even traditional gas stations. I don't know if you've started to see this, but actually the one just down the street from me at my house, they took out some of the parking spaces. And so now next to the gas pumps, there's an EV charging day and you can get 10 cars in there. And because you think about it, yet. No. Yeah, so you're going to see gas stations start to change, right? Because there's still the other thing. You're on a road trip. You need to stop and get some water or some coffee. You need to go to the restroom. Yeah. You still need to stop, or you still need a place to stop. So you stop, you charge your car, you still go in, and just like if you had a gas vehicle, you'll That's see right. that. So you're seeing a lot of different places that are starting to think about, how can this be part of my business? How can this be a place? And actually, quite honestly, how do you attract customers? Think about a coffee shop, same thing. So, if a customer needs to stop and they can charge their car for 10 minutes, 30 minutes, just however much they need to get, and they can come in and have a cup of coffee while they're waiting. So businesses are really starting to think about, how can this actually be a feature to attract customers and bring them in? So you're going to see it all over the place. And the technology is really neat right now. It's advancing really quickly. There's a lot of links between the EV charging and solar. And so can you have a solar panel that charges your EV charger that then charges your car? So there's a lot of things that are coming on the market. So there'll be a lot more solutions. There's a lot of infrastructure. So between the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of money in both of those that's going to affect a lot of this and how we build these systems out and we get the grid ready for these. If you've read through the Inflation Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of money that's going to be coming over the next kind of 3 to 5 years. And so it's going to be phased out as it rolls out and for all these different areas, which is great because I think it'll allow us time for the technology to catch up to the funding. It actually, again, very reminiscent for me of back to kind of 2008, 2009, when all the money came out for solar and you had like Solyndra. You may remember there was the big investment. And even though that particular business ended up going bankrupt, the technology that came out of that is really what fueled a lot of our current solar industry today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And so I think you're going to see very similar things happen in the next couple of years.
Do you have conversations with your suppliers all the way back to the OEMs of this sort when you're talking about all the prospects that you can envision for the country and particularly for your region? I know you don't personally have those, but does the company, as you are a distributor, have serious conversations about these trends?
Yeah, we do. We absolutely do. For, a number of reasons. I think to get feedback on, the markets that are out there, what we're seeing, to, understand from an installation, a contractor perspective, what's important to them. A lot of this, again, these products are being developed. Some of them exist. Some of them exist, but there's a lot of change happening. So even just getting feedback on what we want the future of this to look like. Even you think about the EV charger, you think about the solar panel, you think about those what I'd consider more technical products, but even things as simple as pipe and wire. A lot of pipe and wire is going to have to go in to install all of these and connect them back to the grid. And so even the products that might not get as much attention in the public side, there's still a lot there. And so these manufacturers are having to think about, how do we ramp up capacity? Where is that going to be? Is that going to be in California, New York? Is it going to be spread across the whole country? Because then that affects logistics, like we talked about earlier with the supply chain. And, understanding it's, the last mile is the hardest. How do you get it to the customer for the last mile? That's the hardest. And that's really where we come in. So again, understanding logistically, where are these things going to be happening and how do we get product positioned so that it's ready to be installed?
You also have developed over the years, we referred to them as branches earlier on, but I'm picturing the whole map of the country and probably within 50 to 100 miles of anyone, there would be a Rexel branch. Is that about right? Depending. Yeah, I know you got some big spaces out there. Right. Even the prairie dogs are lonely out in some of those parts of the country. But basically, I guess I'm getting at is you have something that a lot of global companies maybe even in the same domain don't. You still have people on the ground, people who are neighbors to the community, people who listen, and people who explain. So that
Absolutely.
while you're talking at this really great level of prospects and so forth, there could be important conversations that will eventually happen because they can say, oh, yeah, pipes and wires. Well, what do you mean pipes and wires? Well, recognize that all these great electric wind generators, that's a lot of pipe and there's a lot of wire. And it's coming, and there are parts of York State where those things probably are look like an army of giant birds, because you've got the wind. And so it's exciting as hell, Whitney. You made me so jealous.
It is. It's fun. It's good, exciting stuff. I was actually in a meeting with a vendor last week, and we were having the same conversation and made the comment that, the next 10 to 15 years might be some of the most exciting time we have from an electrical product standpoint, just in terms of the development. I mean, you have a couple of segments that you think about LED lighting and solar to an extent. The last decade or so has really taken off, and we've seen a lot of that, but you're going to see those trends across the board. I mean, if you've heard of one of the other things that's really kind of starting to get a foothold is the idea of a smart home. So you have your Alexa, you have your thermostat, you have, your cameras, your lights. Well, that all has to be charged by a smart device or a smart panel in your house. So the whole industry is changing, and the products and the way that they interact and the way that we as consumers interact with them is changing. So it's going to be a pretty exciting time. And, a lot of the things that we're trying to do from an energy and environmental standpoint depends on this infrastructure, depends on these products that are in place in order to be able to achieve them. If you're going to do, demand reduction for electric use on a hot day kind of thing, you have to have these products in place. So it's going to be interesting as all this comes out.
Now I'm looking at what I jotted here as we're summarizing and have our only last minute or so of listening time. Anyway, you and I hopefully will never stop getting connected and talking, but I looked at the word changer again, and I'm thinking the next 10 to 15 years could be among the most exciting in regard to all the innovations that are being driven now by funding, by circumstance, and you name it. Also looking at the fact that in order to bring in a young workforce, they want to be part of something exciting. They want to feel that they can be part of changing. They could become changers too. So I think the timing is very, very good for Whitney Walrath, the changer, also vice president for business development for Rexel. And any last thoughts, Miss Changer? Well, you can throw that into the family too. You have two lovely young boys, and you and your husband certainly are going to be proud of all the changes that families are going through too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, we can't stop change. It's coming whether we like it or not. So I try to embrace it. I try and, appreciate it for what it is. Keep the things that work, don't throw out the stuff that we've learned, the lessons we've learned, keep those things. And those, I think you can plug in and reuse and are, should stay with us. But just be open to what's coming. And one of my favorite things to do, and what you and I always did when we worked together, is just to brainstorm, just to think about, well, what if we completely got rid of that whole thing that we thought was the answer and we started all over. And, I like to look at it from different people's perspectives and put myself in somebody else's shoes, what would be important to them. And I think for me, it's exciting. It's fun, and really being able to work with people and collaborate and just take the mystery out of it a little bit. I think a lot of people are afraid of change, which is understandable. But the more that we can just be open about it and communicate, I think that really helps everybody get on board.
Wow. Well, you heard it here, folks, on the Practice Podcast. Thank you so much, Whitney. This has been extraordinarily exciting for me. You've lifted my spirits about even being in the business right now of promoting practice and in the book and the podcast, and just getting people to pay attention to how much, if they take responsibility as you are doing for their own happiness in work, in business, and find things that are new and grow with it, hey, we're both in a good place.
No, thank you, Doc. I always enjoy our conversations. It's great.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Oh, and one more thing. How could I forget? The book on practice as a way of being is available now in digital form, something that would be new, like podcasting to many of us. And it's a great way of learning more and more about what this podcast presented when Peter Vale and I originated it several years ago. So please come to mylibrary.world/practice, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you.